It is my pleasure, actually, to welcome the esteemed Dr. Tyrone McKinley Freeman, who is going to have a great conversation with me today, I promise, and I won't go too hard on you. Dr. Freeman is an award winning scholar and teacher who serves as assistant professor of philanthropic studies and director of undergraduate programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Previously, he was a professional fundraiser for social services, community development, and higher education organizations. He is also the associate director of the fundraising school, where he trained nonprofit leaders in the US, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And in addition to those accomplishments, he has been featured in a number of magazines and publications from Oprah Magazine to Time. And he's written a number of pieces, one being Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, the Black Woman's Philanthropy During the Jim Crow, which we are here to discuss today. So I want to welcome you, Dr. Freeman, as we get into this conversation, but also as we are in Philadelphia, and you have a little bit of a Philly history. Let's get into that first.
Yes, well, thank you, Monique, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. First, I just got to say thank you again to Monique for stepping up and being a part of this, and to Janine. All this started with Janine kind of reaching out and then connecting with Latifa Fields and as always support. So just thank you to Beacon, thank you to the 100 Black women, and to you and all for everyone for showing up. Yes, I'm particularly excited because Philly is home. I grew up in New Jersey, but my mother's from North Philly, and my grandparents and aunts and others and lived there, and so I spent pretty much half my childhood there, from summers to holidays to weekends, because we were only 2 hours away being in New Jersey. So it's home. So I love this and appreciate that. I also am a proud graduate of the Lincoln University, right outside of Philly. So lots of connections there. And actually, I'm indebted to my faculty from Lincoln all those years ago, because those were the first, there's a few people there who were the first ones who told me that I could write a book and that I should, and that who encouraged me along my way, as HBCUs are known to do. So very grateful to be here, very excited, and thanks to everybody for tuning in.
No, that's awesome. So I want to level set this conversation because there were a number of things in this book, and Janine kind of mentioned them earlier, that, even though this was based on something a time 100 years ago, it's very relevant. So I want to today. So I want to back up and just kind of have you talk about what society and what time was during the point and period of this book of her giving.
Sure. Well, Madam Walker lived between 1867 and 1919. And there's several historical errors that go in there. So 1867 would put her right 2 years after formal emancipation from the institution of slavery, right at the end of the Civil War. And she was born on a cotton plantation in Delta, Louisiana. She was the first freeborn child to a family that had been enslaved. So you can imagine the joy her mother must have felt at holding this child, the first of five children that she was able to birth. And this child actually took breath as a free person, which was a new experience for them. And then, again, her death occurs in 1919 in New York. And so between that time, from the Civil War, emancipation, Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, segregation, lynchings, racial terror, all those things going on, and then the so-called progressive era in the early 20s, Madam Walker is living at a critical turn of the 20th century moment, where there are numerous movements for change, social change, movements against lynching, movements for temperance, movements for civil rights and women's rights. And so she's in the mix of all these things, and she ends up putting her own little fingerprint on them in her own unique way through her generosity. And so the book that's the historical backdrop for the book, and the times that she lived and the things that she was experiencing that she was contributing to.
No, that's awesome. I know as I was reading it, I was looking at the giving amounts, and I actually had to look up, what the difference was in the inflation rates, because you think like, oh, she gave $50 here, she gave $50 there, and today that might be nothing. That might be a week's worth of lunch or Starbucks, but in reality, that was thousands of dollars. And I think that when you kind of think about that and put that into context, it really drove home to me just how much she was giving, and it wasn't a small amount. Um, but I want to take one quick step back, because she went through so many different transformational periods of history that I definitely know from your book, and just from just understanding what was going on, that her lived experience shaped who she was, between what was going on in her home life to what was going on in society and trying to find her way in there. Um, so let's talk about how her lived experience and how lived experience shapes your practice of giving.
Yeah, thank you. So, and actually, embracing and engaging her lived experience was the key to opening up her philanthropy, because she doesn't really fit the typical and traditional models of philanthropy that we focus most of our time and energy on. And I confronted this when I was in her archives. Her archives are here in Indianapolis at the Indiana Historical Society, 200 boxes. They're digitized now, but when I started this, they weren't. So for me, it was a lot of dust and a lot of handwork. But it was incredible because the way in which she lived her life day to day was a model of generosity and philanthropy. And it was very different than what some of the leading people who were in the papers all the time, like Andrew Carnegie and others, were different. And yet, but that's the way we're trained to think about what philanthropy is and who does it and what it looks like. So I needed a completely different frame of reference when I was looking at her records and what she was trying to do. And this is where following her daily movements came into play. The black newspapers are really interesting from this time frame because they're kind of like a diary. Um, oh, we get a little interference. So the black newspapers are literally like a diary during this time frame. Monique, if you went to go visit I don't know, your niece in North Carolina, they would say today, Monique Curry Mims left for North Carolina to go visit her niece. I mean, so you could literally retrace Madam Walker's steps and see where she was and what she was doing and who she was with and what was going on. And that's when this story of generosity opened up, because she was so giving of herself. And of course, the newspapers are tracking her because she's this famous person by the 19 teens. So it's interesting, but I had to go back even before to say, well, when did this start? And so this started earlier in her life when, as you said, we didn't kind of say this, but since she was born on a cotton plantation, first freeborn child, but by the age of 7, both of her parents had died. So she's an orphan, right? And she's under the care of her older sister. They leave Louisiana and go across the river to Vicksburg, Mississippi in search of better opportunity. Um, uh, there's the Jim Crow culture, emerging culture in Louisiana is particularly harsh, hoping to get a little opportunity in Mississippi. She starts working as a washerwoman around 10 or 11, which was very difficult work. And then she gets married in her mid-teens, has a child, but then her husband dies. So she's a widow, right? And she's a single mother. And Jim Crow is being constructed around her. So you can imagine the sense of desperation, the sense of frustration, the terror going on around her. That's what causes her to flee and go north to St. Louis in Missouri. And it's in St. Louis where her brothers are there. They have a barbershop that's doing pretty well. But she also is greeted by this very strong philanthropic safety net, if you will, that's created by Black people for Black people. The St. Paul AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, is kind of at the center, but there's an orphanage, there's some social services. The women of the church have set up these structures to take in arriving migrants and help them get settled in St. Louis or to keep on moving on their journeys to the next city. And so this is where Sarah Breedlove's life begins to transform, and she begins that transition into the person who would become Madam Walker. But being in the presence and community of all of those Black women, those church women, those club women, right? And then that's the example today, right? Because there are millions of Black church women and club women today doing the same thing. But they don't necessarily get the credit for it. They don't end up in the newspaper. But this is the bedrock of the Black church and of the community. Those women embraced her and helped her get back on her feet. And it is then that she reports that she became a giver. when she was still struggling, when she was this struggling, poor, widowed, single mother, she became a giver. She just discovered that she too had something to give and to share and could contribute to this larger struggle. And so that is the roots of her philanthropy. And it only expands and becomes more as she acquires resources and becomes a millionaire and do all those things. So I was really wanted to tell that story of how she came to it, what she was trying to do, what she gave, and what it all meant. Because it's not about wealth, it's about generosity and being willing to make yourself available to others to help them get through and get by, and to bring down the structures that are oppressing and creating problems in the community like Jim Crow.
So you've mentioned traditional philanthropy and generosity and her way of philanthropy. Why are there all of these different understandings of philanthropy? Right? Like, why is it that there's the Black philanthropy and there's her philanthropy? But if it's just philanthropy, right? And I was going to have this conversation a little later, but since we're here, right? Like, it's the love of humanity, the love for humanity, and her love was built within her lived experience, right? So the generosity that she was given is how she understood how to give back, because she wanted to give in a way that she knew would be more useful. I remember there was a passage in your book and you were talking about her wanting to get to Tuskegee and them wanting her to give a certain amount, and she's like, well, I want to give this for this student and do this, and they're like, well, that's not what we want. And it's like, well, she was actually trying to help the person, not the institution, right? Like that kind of goes beyond what is actually needed at a point. Like, if you're here to educate the person and she's trying to help that person, but that wasn't the philanthropy that they were looking for. So I don't know if there was a point in time where that was the definitive, like, philanthropy is traditional philanthropy and we had to have all these caveats for other things, but just why? Like, in your opinion, because I'm sure you don't have the definite answer, but if it's just a love for humanity, why do we have to differentiate philanthropy?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And part of what I'm trying to get at the heart of this book, because the imagery of philanthropy, the public narrative about philanthropy is actually it's one that is focused on white wealthy elites. You look at our newspapers, the ones who get the attention are the billionaires making the big gifts, and they will more than likely be white individuals, right? And that's the history of the way in which we think about it. Even 100 years ago, Andrew Carnegie's all over the newspapers, right? But the reality is philanthropy is a human phenomenon. It's not a white phenomenon. And it's not a wealthy phenomenon only. It is something that all of us can engage and can participate in. And indeed, we come from communities that do. Now, some communities may not use the word at all.
Right.
In fact, I know in my, I come out of the Black church. I'm the son, grandson, nephew, and cousin of Black Baptist preachers and first ladies, including my grandfather was a minister in Philadelphia, King Solomon Baptist Church. And not one of them would ever use the word philanthropy to describe what they're doing, but they're very generous people. They taught me generosity, and not just tithes and offerings, but being available, being of service, speaking a good word to someone who's down, going to visit the sick and shut in, delivering communion, or running to the pharmacy for somebody. All the different ways that people help and engage and look after. That these are just the way this is what you're supposed to do according to these communities, right? So there's no expectation that it needs to be labeled something other than doing what you're supposed to do, or maybe it's doing the Lord's will, right? From that religious sensibility, right? Which is what my mom or my grandmother would say, right? So I think there are different understandings which again reflect the different views on who we focus on. And so I think our media still places focus on attention on the very wealthy people, the wealthy elites, and what they do. And what I wanted to do with this book and saying, well, here's a woman who's engaging in that kind of philanthropy where she certainly is giving her money and giving more than the average person might be able to give because she has more, but that's not what it's about for her. This started when she had nothing. Wealth just became one more thing that she could give away, but she was already generous to the core. And that's what I think is a powerful lesson for all of us now, that we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait until we become more or we do more or have more. We can give now. And so you're right. Philanthropy at its root is a Greek word for love of mankind. anybody can engage in that. And so this is trying to give voice to this tradition that explains Madam Walker's giving, because she's not a Black version of Carnegie. She's doing something that was uniquely among Black women, and within the Black community.
So there's a question in the chat which I think is timely. Philanthropy versus charity, are they one and the same?
Yeah, so this is actually a source of debate, and there's I can give you readings on both and then different perspectives on both. But here's the short way that is typically thought about: that charity is a kind of impulsive, religiously inspired, compassion-based approach of giving to meet an individual's need as you encounter it. So, classic example might be you kind of minding your business on a walk, and there is someone on the corner who tells you they're hungry and they're asking you for money, right? So you might decide to give that person money. Now, you were just minding your business, walking your dog, doing whatever. You weren't planning on that. It was just this encounter, right? So that kind of approach is tended to be thought about as charity. Around Madam Walker's lifetime, there was this movement called scientific philanthropy that came on across the ocean from England, and it basically said that charity is a problem because it's too emotional, and that person will still be hungry tomorrow even if you give them money today. So why don't we use science and rationalism and try to deal with the issues that have that person on the corner to begin with? And so the scientific philanthropists saw themselves as dealing with the large scale societal level issues so that you wouldn't have to deal with beggars on the corner. Right, so that's where the dichotomy comes from, and so in many ways they're two sides of the same coin. You help somebody one to one, or you help help on a large scale. Madam Walker is actually operating at both levels, if you will, or in both ways, and for her that distinction is not that important. She is giving in a very relational way. She is giving, and I say in the book that every gift that she gave was one that she once herself needed, right? So she has a different relationship to the community she's serving and to the need to begin with, right? It doesn't matter how much money she had. She had 3 cars and she had a 34-room, $250,000 mansion, right? That didn't matter. She was still Black. She was still a female in racist, sexist Jim Crow America, right? So she could be lynched, she could be raped, right? She all of those threats that any Black person faced, she could be still subject to. So her wealth did not rescue her from that. So she has this proximity to these issues that informed her philanthropy and gave her a firsthand understanding of the need and how to serve her community. And so that's why you see her giving in-kind gifts. You see her giving people food at Thanksgiving and Christmas. You see her writing out monetary donations, but you also see her using her voice, engaging in activism and advocacy, trying to change public policy, right? Trying to change institutions and build institutions to kill Jim Crow, right? So she's operating and she moves back and forth. So today we might think about these separately, but looking much at her life, it wasn't an important distinction to her. She wanted to be of service. She thought of herself as a good race woman, which was the term that people of that day would think. I'm a race man, I'm a race woman, which means I'm for the Black community. I'm trying to uplift the Black community out of the scourge of racism and Jim Crow.
So I thought it was, as you were listing the things that she gave, I found it very interesting in the book, especially as an entrepreneur, that the one thing that she did not give was product, no matter who asked and why, because she felt that, as you said, that was the money, that was the income, and she'd be able to sell it to get the income to then give the dollars where they were really needed, instead of just giving away free product for a raffle or whatever the case may be. And also the fact that her product allowed for her to hire women. So back to your scientific, because you're going to get me on my soapbox here, because I mean, look at where we are in 2020. Obviously, the scientific methods that came over from wherever did not work, because our communities are still hindered by progress and by the same things, if not worse things, than they were around that time. So one, I thought it was very interesting because she believed that by giving opportunity to women, in my mind, that was her scientific thought, that women were the center of the community in the house. And if she's able to uplift them, she'd be able to uplift the Black family as well as the Black community. So, whose scientific method, like that, in my opinion, that was her method. Every scientific method isn't for every community and isn't for every being. So I want you to dig a little bit deeper into that, if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely. And by saying that the distinction wasn't that important to her, I wasn't at all saying that she did not have a method to what she was
Okay.
doing, right? She definitely had a way of thinking about these issues, definitely a sense of responsibility to her community, and all of that informed what she was doing. So I don't want to give, that's not to say that she was haphazard or she's just kind of throwing money around. No, she had a method to it, and she was very clear that being a part of networks of women was important to her, because it was networks of women that really produced her. These church women, these club women, right? She was also a part of a fraternal order that I talk about in the book, and this fraternal order was engaged in charity and activism and other things. And then she organized her own sales agents into benevolent clubs so that they could not only sell products but also engage in activism. So you definitely see her, right? There is a method to the approach. She is definitely harnessing the power of women's generosity and women's economic power, influence, and their voices. And she's challenging them. I mean, think about many of these were working class, what we would think of as working class Black women who had few options in a Jim Crow economy that could care less about them, right? This economy wanted them to be cleaning people's houses, right? Watching people's kids. It didn't want them to thrive, right? But here comes Madam C.J. Walker and saying, you could become a Walker agent, right? And you can work for my company, or you can hang up your own shingle and do hair out of your living room, right? Or I will give you money and you can open up your own salon, right? So it was a completely different way of life and a brand new economic avenue for people. So she's definitely providing opportunity and using her business as a philanthropic institution, which is something we might be suspicious of now. We hear a corporation gave money here, we're like, what are they really up to? What are they into? But Madam Walker was very clear that her company, in fact, I like to joke and say it was kind of the original FUBU company, the for us by us, right? That she was very clear on that this was going to provide jobs for African Americans in a society that does not want them to have meaningful jobs, and that in the process of making this new economic way for yourself, you have a responsibility to raise your voice, to give your money, to volunteer, to engage in the struggle, because it's going to take all of us to beat back this thing called Jim Crow.
Um, Jory, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, wants to know, did she meet with any resistance in this work, in her professional and philanthropic giving in that time, in that climate?
I'm wondering resistance in terms of maybe from the broader society. Is that the direction, or?
Says given the climate of society at that time. So was there any
Yeah.
pushback, being that successful Black woman? I thought it was very interesting when she bought her mansion and where it was bought, and I was like, oh, they let her
Oh,
buy
shit.
that?
Yeah, right. Yeah. There was a lot of whispering, like, who's moving in? Oh my God, have you seen? She's Black. Oh my God. Like, yeah, there's all this. Yeah, the newspapers were kind of going crazy. But she was a very much she faced resistance from Black men, right? Remember, Black women, right? You all know far better than me, right? But you're not only dealing with white racism, you're dealing with sexism from your own men, right? So she's definitely confronting that as she's dealing with people like Booker T. Washington and other Black leaders of the time, right? Which is an important part of her story too that I'm trying to tell. But it's interesting that these networks of women were spaces where women leveraged and nurtured their own power and their own voices so that they could be the kinds of advocates that they wanted to be for their communities. And this is why understanding these traditions of the ways in which Black church women organize themselves and Black club women organize themselves is very important, because these were staples of how they survived that. Now, Madam Walker did end up under surveillance by the United States government because she was starting to become
Affiliated.
yes, Pan-Africanist in her thinking, as many African Americans were during this time frame, this World War I time period, and Black people were starting to connect their own struggle domestically with the struggle of Black people in Africa and other places around the world. And so she's interacting with people like Marcus Garvey, who's very controversial, right? And the government already has him in the crosshairs. She's interacting with Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. out of Harlem, an activist and minister there. A. Philip Randolph, a labor leader who's identified with the Communist Party. She's definitely under surveillance, and the government is watching her. And this is also when new tax laws are brought to bear to help fund the war. So then she becomes a target regarding, this $1 million and how's the government going to get its share. There's a war to pay for. So she definitely was under surveillance. Definitely had resistance. Her passport was revoked because of these relationships, right? So and even the United States Postal Service investigated her company for alleged mail fraud, right? So these are all kinds of ways in which the government is coming down and trying to clamp down on her. But she dies shortly, before all that kind of fully plays out. But so she faced those kinds of things. But she was, in the middle, in the mix with the leading movements of the day. And so that's par for the course. We know all of those leaders were under surveillance, and that's what they had to deal with.
Lanice wants to know, would you explore the idea of moral imagination? In your opinion, what was Madam Walker's moral imagination? Is this the driving force behind her philanthropy?
Yeah, so the moral imagination is that part of us that looks out at the world and sees what's wrong with it, and then feels compelled to take action to do something about that. And so, whatever, all of us on this webinar tonight, we all have values and issues that concern us, right? And so, that moral imagination is the part of you that compels you to do something about that, to take action, to give, to advocate, to protest, to engage, to help, whatever that might be. And it's that part of you that allows you to hopefully empathize with those who are suffering under those situations, so that you can use that suffering and respect their agency and their understanding, right, to inform the way in which you respond. And so for Madam Walker, the first chapter in the book, Making Madam Walker, is really the story of the development of her moral imagination, that part of her that decides that she wants to be of service to her race, and to her gender. And I talk about the different institutions and contexts that help to shape it. The African Methodist Episcopal Church is one of those. Not only was it those women who kind of rescued her, if you will, and mentored her, right? But the church itself, think about it. Again, Jim Crow is emerging all around you, yet you can walk into this building every week, right? And it's owned by Black people. The land underneath your feet is owned by Black people. All the people in charge are Black. The money is Black, right? And in this space, they have autonomy. And this is an institution that's building Black schools in the South, right? That they have their own newspapers and publications, and they're writing articles about the leading issues of the day, right? And they're advocating and speaking truth to power about segregation, right? And so they're building a new world, and they're trying to fight, right? Which is very different than what she saw in Delta, Louisiana. And the fact that it's an international, that the AME Church is doing work in Africa on the ground with missionaries there, building schools, engaging with local peoples, right? And sharing their faith and trying to build up an infrastructure there to support those communities, right? So I argue this expands her imagination so much so that she wants to build a school in Africa, right? And that becomes a big goal for her. And then that fraternal order that I mentioned is another space that helps to shape her, because it prized charity and being of service and understanding one's Christian duty to others and how to live that out. So the moral imagination, again, is how we think about others suffering, and then how we decide we want to take action to do that. And so I show how Madam Walker's developed, and I also hope that it will inspire readers to think more intentionally about their own moral imagination and what has shaped them. Who are the people or the institutions? For some of us, it's our parents, right? Or we may have had some experience with suffering, and then that informs the way we want to engage. Or it might be institutions like a house of worship, or it might be some other experience. But it being in tune and tapped with our moral imagination is a way of thinking about our philanthropy and why we feel compelled to act. And it also is it's a cautionary tale, because there's a lot of philanthropists throughout history who've actually done harm, right? Who ignore the agency of the communities they say they want to serve, right? And who come in with an agenda and just say, here's what's going to happen, instead of becoming a part of conversations and helping a community to develop its responses. So the moral imagination is this double-edged sword, because we can become so convinced that we know what the issues are and so convinced that we are the ones to solve it, that we ignore the very people we say we're there to help. And so it's a cautionary thing to be mindful of as well.
You took the fire out my next question because
Uh-oh.
because I mean, because that was the point of it though, right? Like your imagination is that it is your imagination, and her lived experience and what she went through. It wasn't even that it shaped her imagination. It shaped her facts, right? Like she was a living fact of what happened and what could happen to a single woman, and what she needed to go through to get to where she was. And I feel as though some people who are so far removed from these situations, their imaginations run wild, and then they become saviors, right?
Mhm.
They've been trying to do it for themselves all these years. I need to swoop in and just be the savior. Um, so I won't ask that question because you kind of already answered it. But
Yeah.
it is a double-edged sword. But I will ask this because you repeatedly mentioned her company being the little C.
Huh.
And I thought that that was very interesting, especially when we're in this delicate space currently
Mm,
where intention is not accurate. You know, we're caught up in the current Black Lives Matter and racial injustice, justice that are going on, and we have a lot of organizations that are just trying to keep up for PR sake and not
mm.
trying to make intentional change because they're more worried about their big C and not the little C. Um, so, what can companies, in terms of their corporate social responsibility, and how they're actually thinking about the people that they serve, and not
Mhm.
just, I'm trying to make money off of them, but like I'm in their community, how am I actually supporting them other than just giving them a product and taking their money? What can they learn from Madam CJ Walker and her moral imagination and the way that she structured her 3 C's?
Yeah, thank you. So just to give the audience a little background on that. So in the book, I talk about how, Black women had some particular spaces that they used to do their philanthropy and their activism. And so the first is the church, right? And so it talked about kind of how Black church women have this deep, rich history of being engaged in their community, being of service. The second are clubs, Black women's clubs, like the National Association of Colored Women, right? And it was through their clubs that they provided education, they provided social services, hygiene services, art, engaged in all voting rights and all these different things, right? So Black women's clubs are very important. That's the second C. So I argue that Madam Walker, she was a part of a church, she was a part of many different clubs, but she also used her company as a third C, kind of in this idea of creating her own platform from which to do this philanthropic work. And she brought to bear her company to these issues of the race. And so for her, she's doing social entrepreneurship 100 years before it's a buzzword in business schools, right? That for her, the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company of Indiana, well, yes, it had to make profit, but yes, it also had to uplift the race. She was very clear about that, very intentional about that, and how she structured employment opportunities for people and providing shares of the company to employees is all a part of this idea that this company is the platform. She did not set up a separate foundation like Andrew Carnegie did. That was way and separate apart from his company, right? Her foundation was the company, right? And so understanding that as a basis is important, and that's how she came into it, and that's how she thought about her responsibility. So it's not a side project. It's not just a sponsorship to get your name somewhere. It's a fundamentally embedded value and part of the DNA of the company. So that's one thing. I think having that perspective. The other thing is when you think about, right now there's over $6 billion has been given to racial equity causes over the past 6 or 7 months, and it's very important to think about what Madam Walker offers to those donors who made those gifts, right? Because one of the things, and I tell the story here in the book, is that Madam Walker, as a wealthy philanthropist, when she gets to that stage in her life, is funding Black schools like Tuskegee, was now Tuskegee University. She's funding social service organizations. She's funding all these different movements and different things. but she's relating to those organizations very differently than Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, John F. Slater, all the white industrial philanthropists who were very paternalistic in the ways in which they engaged Black organizations and who had expectations of maintaining the racialized status quo, not overturning it, because they did not want to upset their white clientele. Right. And so it's a very different relationship that she has with her grantees, if you want to use that word, than they had with theirs. She knows the struggle. She's not making them jump through hoops and do the same kind of dance as they have to do for Carnegie and others. Mary McLeod Bethune is in the book. Madam Walker supported her school. They have a very close relationship because they knew each other through the Women's Club, the National Association of Colored Women, right? So the relationships are very important. The networks are very important. And I think this is a lesson for donors giving at these very high levels right now. Don't come in and assume you have the answers. You don't have the answers. That's why we're in this situation, right? And this is particularly a cautionary tale for, like, some of the tech billionaires in the Silicon Valley, right? Who do have a particular kind of expertise that is really valued in this economy. But we also know that Silicon Valley is not very equitable, right? So you have to rely upon, this goes back to the agency issue, right? That respecting the communities that you want to support, give them the money and let them go ahead and do what they do. Stop the strings, stop hovering, ask how you can be of service, ask how else you can advocate politically, because we need public policy change too. There's systems that need to be reformed, right? There's other things that need to be addressed, but give your money and don't stop now, right? Give the same thing next year and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. Keep showing up for these organizations and honor their expertise, honor their proximity to the issue because they know what diversity, equity, and inclusion is all about, right? They know the struggle, right? Let them do the work, fund them to do the work, and trust them. We've had 20 or 30 years, right, where donors have come in, right, and have had all these strings attached to their gift, and they've wanted to be hands-on, and they've wanted to engage and do things, and that has not always been best for the mission or the organization. And a lot of organizations have dealt with mission creep and reshaping and forming themselves to do these dances for donors. I think now is not only a racial reckoning, but it's a reckoning for donors to realize that for all of your success in other arenas, that does not necessarily translate to success in this particular area of human need that these agencies and people and activists have always been on the front lines of serving. Allow them to step front and keep providing that leadership while you add that voice and you add those resources to be a partner in that work. That's what Madam Walker was doing. She didn't swoop in
Amen.
and assume that she knew.
Amen. Yeah, I got all these personal horror stories like bubbling in me, like yes, 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 yes. But we're not going to go into that right now. Um, but so I want to move a little forward, or I guess a lot forward into her legacy,
Yeah, okay.
because the one thing that I found particularly interesting, and you mentioned it a little while ago, was that it wasn't that she was just giving; she was creating a culture of giving, and she created this system of, or this sphere of influence where anyone who came to work for her, you know, got caught up in that spirit. And you didn't mention in your book, and I think you might have said someone might be working on a book, but what was the impact that she just had overall, like beyond her personal giving and this whole sphere, from her daughter to the people who work from her to anyone else? Because I just feel like even today, I mean, when I read this book, I I put it down in the middle of it and I started doing something else. And now, because it just inspired me beyond giving, right? Like it empowered me in my business, where I was like, you know what? I've been slacking. I need to go in here and send these emails and make these calls because like I'm slacking. Right?
Mm.
So her, like the way that she just influences, empowers people beyond what happened at the end of 1919, like is there any kind of reconciliation around that to understand how big it was?
So when she died in 1919, a whole bunch of telegrams flooded the office for her company, where people were expressing their grief when they heard the news. And one of the themes that cuts across, I mean, there's hundreds of these telegrams in the archives, but one of the themes is how generous she was. right? That people knew the story of her gifts and her giving. And they would just say, oh, she was a great benefactress of the race. She was a great race woman. She was so benevolent. She was so, oh, we're going to miss her generosity, right? So that part of her story really connected with people, and was a model for people. And so that's important. And then it's important to think about the way that she structured her estate. I talk about in the legacy chapter that you mentioned. It's really the conversations that she had with her attorney as she's structuring her will to dispose of her assets upon her death. And even during this, she's talking about all the joy that comes from thinking about this and how she wishes she could do all these things while she was still alive. But she saw herself as having a responsibility to people, individuals, and to organizations and the larger struggle. And so she's naming specific people to give money to or to give other property to and resources. Some of these are family members, some of these are employees who she's rewarding. There were some of her employees that ended up receiving income for the rest of their lives, and they used that to get education, again, in Jim Crow America, right? To fundamentally transform their own lives and move into somewhat of a middle class existence, right? Where they can continue engaging and helping others. So there's all these kind of ways in which she's helping individuals. But then the other thing that I talk about is how every single generation since her death has taken her story up, done something with it of their own, and then kind of propelled it forward. And so in the 20s and the 30s, there was a black soprano named Ravella Hughes who sang a song about Madam Walker as a part of her show, a very well-known singer from the time. Zora Neale Hurston, the anthropologist and great novelist, wrote a novel based on Madam Walker's life, but the manuscript was destroyed in a fire, so we never got to see it. But there's documentation that she was working on this and did this, right? Because she was touched and she knew Madam's daughter. Duke Ellington, the great Duke Ellington, wrote an opera named based on Madam Walker's life. That he died before it was fully finished, but it eventually was finished and actually was presented a few times, right? And most recently, right? I mean, there's always been community plays and regional plays and more books. And Lilia Bundles, Madam Walker's great great granddaughter, wrote the definitive biography 20 years ago, and then most recently this past year, right, we have the Netflix series where a new generation is introduced to her, right? So her story is very powerful, it's very palpable, it's still with us to this day. And to this point about the method and the impact, we see it in the lives of everyday people. There's a whole neighborhood on the north side of Indianapolis where many of her employees lived, and it became essentially this black suburb, right? Because they were empowered by the economic base from the company, right, to move up to that next level, right, and to provide a better opportunity for the next generation. And then also, and here's was something that was very, very, very powerful for me when I came across in 1952. There was a graveside memorial in the Bronx, New York, at Madam Walker's gravesite, where members of the executives from her company, as well as Black beauticians who had gathered from around the country to celebrate her, are holding this memorial site. And at this site, Walter White, who at the time was the executive secretary or the CEO of the NAACP, makes a speech standing over her grave. And he says that without Madam Walker's generosity, the NAACP would not have survived the Great Depression.
Wow.
And he says this in 1952 on the cusp, right, of all the civil rights movement change that's about to come, right? So the NAACP is in position, right, and is ready to go, in part because of Madam Walker's generosity and the whole generosity of her generation that produced that organization, funded it and supported it and propelled it forward to the next generation, even though she wouldn't live to see it. Right.
Amazing.
So it's very powerful, right? So all of those gifts make a difference. And it's very important to think about that. So it makes you ask now, what are we building now, right? That will be here for the next generation that we won't live to see, but will be in position right when they need it. So it can move across the finish line with those public policy changes or those other life-saving changes that are needed to make society more just and more equitable.
Wow. That's, I mean, that is an amazing legacy. And I mean, I hope that myself and, the people on this call are inspired enough to just kind of ask yourself, what is a legacy that you want to leave behind?
Mm.
Um, yeah, and what are you going to do to get there? Because I mean, I'm like I said, I just had to stop. And my husband was like, "What's wrong?" I'm like, "I gotta work. I got look, I just got inspired. Like that whole week I was just thrown. Like I just got to focus because what she did eat, and like I said, back to the point of like she didn't give away her product. And not that I give away services, but understanding the impact of the work that she was doing and how far reaching it was at that time as well was just so powerful to me.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Um,
let me say this since you just mentioned that you felt the need to work, because the other part of this is a cautionary tale, because Madam Walker died at the age of 51 from what we would call today stress-related diseases,
I'm not
right?
stressed. I'm not
Right.
stressed.
So hypertension and kidney disease, right? This woman was relentless in her work. She never stopped, right? And on top of that, of building an economic empire, we now know, right? I mean, scientists have confirmed that racism affects the body. It's real. They call it weathering, that they have measured and have identified the biological and physiological impact on the body from dealing with racism, right? And so it's a cautionary tale, right? Especially for all of the Black women who represent this tradition today and who taught Madam Walker how to do it and who have come after her, right? You've got to take care of yourself even as you're doing this work. And that's why it's refreshing to hear many of the Black Lives Matter activists talking about mental health and talking about taking breaks and taking care of themselves and doing retreats and those kinds of things. That has to be a part of the struggle. And this dynamite professor down at Georgia State, Stephanie Evans, found this beautiful picture of Rosa Parks in a yoga pose. It turns out that Rosa Parks was practicing yoga, and she's doing a
What?
whole lot of research on this and on the ways in which Black women have historically taken care of themselves so they can do the work of activism. So that's the other thing to remember, right? We've got to take care of yourselves while you're working to provide for your family and uplift the community. Because if you're not here, right, right, you can't do that work.
Right. You have to take care of yourself so you can take care of everyone else.
Mm.
I know we're coming on the Q&A time, but I just want to ask you one final question about yourself. And I typically, when I interview people, I ask this at the beginning to set the conversation.
Mm.
How do you personally define philanthropy?
Wow. Part of my thinking about philanthropy is really wrapped up in this book that I think it doesn't have anything to do with money at all. I think it's about generosity. Money is just one gift, one kind of gift. It's an important gift, right? I'm not belittling. I'm just saying I think we're too obsessed with a financial notion of philanthropy. But this idea of giving of yourself in many different ways is key for me. Part in my part of my vocation as an educator, I believe that teaching and learning is a form of philanthropy, and that's really what compelled me to want to do some of this. I go back to give you some, since you all are in Philly, some of my Lincoln University roots. When I got to that campus, 17 years old, and I'm standing around. Rooms filled with African Americans and Africans with PhDs, and also I had some white professors there, right? And they were just there to lift me up and my classmates up, and they told us we could do anything, and they got on us when we were slipping, right? But they pushed us and they gave us opportunities, and I'm just indebted to many of them, right? And just that idea of that's where I started to think about teaching as philanthropy. Not only is it kind of one generation gifting, if you will, knowledge to another, or helping another generation construct its own understanding of the world, but also just education is a key, right, to unlocking your own sense of self, to setting out that path, to set you on that destiny, right, and what you're trying to do. And many of my professors, and don't get me wrong, my family always emphasized education, and I knew I was going to college. They made that clear. There was no choice, and that sort of thing. And so I had that kind of encouragement and mentoring from my parents and others in my family. And when I got to Lincoln, and I had all these others who were pouring themselves into me and challenging me to catch a glimpse of who I could become and to step into that and own it, that's just everything, right? So I think about it in that way, and I give a shout out to the exact professor who told me I could write a book, and that she was waiting on the day when she could receive my book. And it was my great pleasure to mail her a copy when this book came out, and that was 25 years ago when she told me that. So education is the gift that keeps on giving, and so that's one way that I see myself as giving, and where I think about giving as being so important and so central to everyday life.
So Quickly, because you just mentioned Philly again. I was shocked, and I don't know who else was, how often Philly was mentioned in this book. I was Googling things like, wait, that happened here. And does that place still exist? Like, I'm like, that's that church down on Sampson Street. Like, I was so shocked because, I mean, so I'm a transplant, but I've been here most of my life at this point. And
Yeah.
I just was so shocked to see the correlation between what was going on in the book and what was going on in Philadelphia. Was there anything that you left out that
Oh, so one part of that I think is well, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, right? I mean,
right?
the roots, right, go right there to Philly when
Yeah.
Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and a few others were denied access in the Methodist Episcopal Church there. They were kicked out, right, and they started their own. And it's very important, right, because they started the Free African Society, which was a mutual aid group. They offered religious services and educational services and social services. And in 1793, when Philly was dealing with the yellow fever pandemic, Richard Allen and those folks stepped up and they started serving the city and helping the city deal with the yellow fever, so much so that many of their members died. And the mayor of Philadelphia gave them a commendation for their service to the city. And so you have these Black folks who are on the front lines of the yellow fever pandemic. And just as many of our churches and other community organizations are on the front line of COVID right now. So this history, right, is that's an unfortunate way in which this history is alive and well today, but it shows that resilience. It shows the ways in which the community has come together, has pooled resources, built its own institutions to meet its own needs when the broader society wasn't meeting those needs, but was erecting barriers and creating those needs, right, and not allowing them to be met in the ways it was being met for other people. So you're right. Yeah. The heart of the AME Church goes right there to Philly. So that is a big part of the story.
Yeah, I was definitely shocked about that. Well, I want to thank you. This was, I mean, we could go on, but I hear my son is not going to allow that to happen much longer.
Uh-oh.
I hear him sneaking down the stairs. But Janine, Zoe, I don't know if there were any additional chat questions that I didn't catch that you want to bring into the fold.
Yeah, so you got them in. So there was one that I think we didn't address, but you got them in. But I encourage people, if you have questions, I still have some questions.
Yeah.
Shoot.
Put them in the chat and we'll bring them out. So this, I think one of the things about this book that really compelled me, and it happens right here on page 3. And I went and found the quote because it didn't come up in this conversation, but I was really struck by it in a very painful way. And I would love to address that, particularly for its relevance today, but it's where you say, you're talking about philanthropy and Black philanthropy and white philanthropy, and you say that the perception is that whites are the primary agents of philanthropy and Blacks are mainly its recipients. And that was so hard to read. I think it was a point at which I was like, okay, I got to get into this book because I had never really thought, those words had never really come through my head. And I thought, God, I know exactly what he's talking about, and that's a horrible thing to read. And so, and it's absolutely still true today. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that concept, how we see it today, and how for those of us, who really want to make a difference right now and don't want to just give our money and tell people what we think should happen, like how can we address that issue?
Yeah, thank you. No, that really is a critical part of this whole book because I had to really deal with that in order to write the book. When I was doing the background research, I was reading widely and in the literature on American philanthropy, on the literature on women's philanthropy, right? All these places where they're supposed to be kind of laying out how this has evolved, and African Americans are virtually absent, just not there. And it blew my mind because I come from the tradition, I come from the community, born and raised in the church, right? The first philanthropic institution. And yet this literature couldn't see that. I didn't understand that. Now there's a whole lot written on what white Americans have done for Black people. So there's this big literature on Black people being helped, but not helping. And that's a problem. right?
Yeah.
And so part of what I hope that this book does, and many other scholars are working on this too, is again changing that image, changing that perception, and say actually this history has been here, and even if you don't recognize it or haven't seen it before, here's a chance for you to see it. And the other thing related to that too is this is where understanding the lived experience came to play, because Madam Walker's a little unique in that there's 200 boxes of her stuff left behind, right? That is rare as far as historical Black figures go. Some have archives, some don't. But remember, right? It was illegal for Black people to gather. It was illegal for them to associate, right? They could be lynched or killed, right? So much of their philanthropy, their organizational work, was under the veil of night and on secrecy, and they had to protect it because if they were caught, they get in trouble. So in some instances, we just don't have records, or they were orally passed on, or those kinds. So they don't fit the traditional ways of providing evidence and records necessarily that, again, authors usually rely upon, right, to do that. So this is why following her around through the newspapers was important, to see where she was, who she was talking with, what she was doing, because you don't go into her archive and then just kind of have this big old box that just says philanthropy and it's all these grantee reports like you would if you go to Andrew Carnegie's archive. It's just very different. It didn't operate that way. So so part of this is again just trying to see African American philanthropy on its own terms and to see Madam Walker on her own terms. And I provide the lenses and the analytical perspectives and theories for doing that so I could tell her story, her gospel of giving. She, as I said, she's not a Black Carnegie. She's not a Black Olivia Sage. She's Madam Walker, and she's representing the ways in which Black women of her era thought about their responsibility to others. And it was other Black women who trained her and taught her. And so she's important because she became this important historical figure who put her own stamp on that tradition, right? So she gives us perfect access to it so that we can engage all the nameless and faceless other thousands and millions of Black women who are doing the exact same thing. We just don't remember their names, or we don't have evidence of their names. So I wanted to very much raise up the tradition and the community that produced her, and not let the idea that she was a millionaire cause us to place her way up here on this pedestal, away from the community that she loves so dear and that produced her. And so understanding that context is important. And then that helps us see Black philanthropy today. That helps us see the Black church women and the Black club women today. It was funny, election day was supposed to be red and blue day. In a lot of places, it was pink and green day because Kamala Harris is an AKA, right? And the Divine Nine showed up and showed out at the polls, right? This is part of that legacy, right? And the Divine Nine, the 9 collegiate African-American sororities and fraternities, all started around Madam Walker's lifetime. They all have their own rich philanthropic traditions and priorities to this day. It is not new. It is who they are, right? They just don't talk about it in the same way, or it doesn't get the same attention. And so part of, I think, our responsibility as people in the nonprofit sector is to expand our notion and definition of who counts as a philanthropist and what counts as a philanthropy, and move beyond the traditional spheres of influence and circles and networks that we typically move in, and start engaging and going to where Black philanthropy lives and where Hispanic philanthropy lives, because all communities have their own traditions of giving and sharing.
Yeah. What I love, I couldn't find it in the book, but I know it's in here, the quote, that's somebody else's quote, that you can study philanthropy and never encounter Blacks, but you can you give me the quote?
Yeah.
I love that quote.
Oh, well, that's my quote. I'm glad you love
that
it.
Is your quote. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. Amelia Bundles is quoting me saying it in the forward, and then I say it again.
Okay. Oh, that's why. Okay.
But, yeah. But it's so what I say is that you cannot study the history of African Americans without encountering their philanthropy. Mm-hmm. It's unfortunate that you can study the history of philanthropy and never encounter African Americans, mm-hmm. right? And that this book is very much a work of protest against that, right? To change that and to say, if you go looking in the typical philanthropy literature, you will not find people of color.
Right.
But if you go to Black women's history, if you go to Africana studies, if you go to Hispanic studies, you will see people of color engaging in a full range of voluntary actions and exhibiting generosity through their own cultural lenses. And so that's very much what I had to do this book. I had to go. I joined the organizations with Black women historians and Africana studies scholars because they're doing so much important work. But and they'll tell you this: they're not interested in philanthropy. They're interested in other questions about Black life and culture. But because this kind of generosity and philanthropy is so rampant, so pervasive, they had to talk about it. They can't get to the issues they care about without dealing with it. But that became an opportunity for me to bring their insights into the kinds of questions and debates and issues we're dealing with in the professional world of philanthropy and fundraising, and say, hey, look at all these, and here's what we can learn, and here's the things that we can bring to bear as we figure out how to engage our diverse donors, as we figure out how to represent them in our mission and give them voice and give them agency and really see them as partners. Right now, national studies show us that people of color report lower levels of being cultivated and solicited compared to white donors. Yeah. That's a problem that fundraisers created. Yeah. There's no other explanation for it, right? We have a limited definition of who we think can give and who should be giving, and we focus on them, right? But there's rich traditions of giving across different communities, and with America's changing demographics, the nonprofit sector has to step up and recognize this and deal with it and engage and open up and change its notion of it. And that's the other thing that I say about, we know that the government actively created Jim Crow, right? And intentionally made life difficult for Black people. We know that the private markets intentionally segregated and locked them out of opportunity and locked them into menial labor, right? But our own beloved nonprofit sector was complicit too. Yeah. And we don't often talk about it. We usually lay it at the feet of universities who might have endowments linked to slavery, but there were white-led social service agencies that wouldn't take in Black children, wouldn't take in Black elderly, right? We know the whole situation with schools, right? So our own sector is complicit in this history, right? And we have an important role to play in this moment of racial reckoning too. And we need to rethink the way we do business, the way we do fundraising, to open up and engage and really connect with the communities that we say we serve, but are we really seeing them and are we really engaging them on their own terms?
Yeah, okay, good. So I think there's two more questions I want to get in. And Lateef, okay. I wasn't sure if you were raising your hand or you were just giving an amen.
It was a bit of both, but it wasn't at that point, it was a bit of both, but there was a question I wanted to ask as well.
Okay, all right. Why don't you go? And then I want to get Ivory's question and Margaret's in.
Okay, right. I was going to pull up Ivory's question.
I know, Ivory, you've had some really good comments.
Yes, yeah.
So I'll make sure you get your question in.
This question is one that I think every year, I've been a member of the coalition for 15 years now. Every year, when we start to promote Madam C.J. Walker, and we always get this question or this, back and forth among non-members primarily. And it's always about, why do we think that Madam C.J. Walker doesn't get as much recognition as being the first self-made millionaire? Yeah. And is it true that it's all based on her being Black and we can't count that as that? Or is it because she was a woman, or is it both? So I just we wanted to know, and Ivory, I think you had great, ESP, yeah. You knew I was going to ask that too. That was in my book over here as well to ask about. But what do you feel about that, Dr. Freeman?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the Guinness Book of World Records has certified Madam Walker as the first self-made female millionaire. It's a point of contention from people because there were other Black entrepreneurs, and it can be challenging to figure out exactly who had what and when. But and particularly Annie Malone is one person whose name keeps coming up, who started the Poro Company, actually hired Sarah before she became Madam Walker, and that was Madam Walker's formal introduction to beauty care was through Annie Malone. And so we have to honor Annie Malone and understand her role in building this industry and her service as a race woman, because she was doing many of the same things, right? But Madam Walker actually left behind the trail where you can go back and quantify her wealth. And so that's why she kind of gets to hold the trophy for now until somebody found some other information, even though we know there are other entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs in the community who had various degrees of wealth. The other thing I would say is that uh, the whole idea of being self-made, one, was not created for Black people. It is a myth of white American success. It was something created for white men, and it was part of that era. And there's all these success myths, and it's a big part. There's a lot of literature written about it from that era. But this is why it's so important that Madam Walker kind of steps into it, right? Because it's kind of crashing down that stereotype or that application, because it's not meant for her. There actually was a different line of thinking on what Black success was, and it wasn't just based upon wealth. It was based upon what you were doing for the race and for liberation. And so by the community's standard of being a success, Madam Walker was successful because she was a race woman who never lost sight of that and was committed to the struggle until the very end. I also push back a little bit at the self-made thing, because again, one, is not meant for her or African Americans generally. But here's the thing. All of us have been helped by someone else. No one is self-made. I don't care what you've done, how much you have achieved, how much you've acquired. Someone helped you somewhere. And when you look at this story, Madam Walker came out of networks of women. It was other Black women that produced Madam C.J. Walker. And so because of that, I prefer to use a term that was coined by the historian Pamela Walker Laird, and to say that Madam Walker was mutually made. Right, that she comes out of these networks of Black women who were uplifting other Black women. And then when she became in position to be of service to others, she began creating new networks of Black women and uplifting them. And the cycle continued. The Walker Company literally existed until a few years ago. The products are still available at Sephora. Her beauty schools existed into the 1970s. There are even some elderly Walker agents who are still around to this day. So generations, right, of change was produced, right? And so I think we can honor her own moxie, her own determination, and all that she inspires and all that she achieves in us, and all that the self-made label acknowledges. But at the same time, by calling her mutually made, we can understand how that really came from, how it unfolded, and it gives us a model to think about how we might be. Who are we mutually making today, and who's helping to mutually make us?
Mm-hmm. I wanted to say this before on the last topic about engaging Black givers. If anybody's more interested, Dr. Freeman wrote a really good column, op-ed guest column in Chronicle of Philanthropy that was published in September. And you can find it. We've never even talked about that, but I thought you gave some really good thoughts, and actually things that I have also experienced. So it rang true to me. So it's a good source for people who are interested in that topic of how to think about engaging people of color in your donor base.
Thank you.
So I want to get to Margaret's question. Our Margaret, one of my Beacon friends.
Okay.
He says, oh, Margaret, I've lost it. Excellent presentation on Madam Walker. Is another book coming with a Black male philanthropist?
Thank you. Yes, you set me up perfectly. Yeah, no, doing all this work on understanding Black women's tradition of generosity, it really is causing me to ask questions about what's gendered about this and what were the men doing. And so that actually is kind of the next project. There is an African-American male philanthropist. I won't say his name because I'm still kind of working that out and all that, but this is a person who lived in the before Madam Walker, actually kind of crosses the 1700s and the 1800s. But yeah, I want to think about how men thought about their responsibility after having spent so much time looking at how the women did. It's clear to me that women were the innovators of this tradition and on the front lines of this tradition. No surprise, right? As they still are to this day. The three founders of the Black Lives Matter, three women. right? The founder of the Me Too movement, a Black woman. The three women who founded August as Black Philanthropy Month, three Black women. It just goes on. So that's that history, right? So this generation is just doing what their foremothers have done. But yes, I do want to look at other spaces and what men were doing and how that plays out, and continue to just tell these stories and really deal with this question of who counts as a philanthropist and who counts and what counts in philanthropy.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, we'll have you back when you write that.
Thank you.
So we have a few minutes left. We had talked about maybe having you read a little bit from the book, so I was wondering if we could do that.
Sure.
I don't know what you selected, but
well, it's a nice concluding statement. But there's no more questions, we can happily do that.
Okay.
Because I was trying to figure out how to wrap up the book, and what I wanted to kind of say, kind of stepping back from the story and what to draw from it. And it's interesting that this kind of came to me having one of those nights, just couldn't sleep. But then my brain just started racing. And so I quickly grabbed my phone off the nightstand and my thumb started moving, and this came to me. And so here it is. And this is at the end of page 198. Generosity is ultimately a form of hope. We give as an expression of the possibilities to which we aspire and that we want to make real. We give not only because the need is so overwhelmingly great, but in spite of its greatness. We are not deterred, though we might be daunted. Our gift represents the possibility of a different tomorrow. The hope wrapped up in each gift, no matter its size, is the hope of Daniel against Goliath. Over time, when our hope is merged with the hope of others through giving, mountains are moved and rivers are reversed. A gift by an African American during Jim Crow was an act of resistance and hope, an expression of dignity, and a signal that no matter the conditions, as long as one could give, the human soul would not be crushed.
Great sentiment for Giving Tuesday. Snap, snap, snap. Total coincidence that we organized this thing for Giving Tuesday. It was really more about when we could get all these calendars converged.
That's right.
That's a great way to end. We had a lot of enthusiastic comments. I know that a lot of people who haven't read this are motivated now to read it. So I, remind you again in the chat, there's the code from the publisher for the 30% discount. And let either me or Latifa or Zoe know if you want to have a signed book plate, and we'll tell Dr. Freeman and he'll send them and we'll get it to you. You can put in your book. I want to echo what Monique said. I completely understand that there is something about reading this book that kind of revs you up. It feels like a call to action in a way that it's, and for me, when I read it, I've had to, there's a lot in here to make me think, new things to learn. And I've had to sort of read it in chunks, put it down, absorb, read another chunk, put it down, absorb, because it does kind of rev you up and get you thinking. And I've, wanted to have time to reflect on it. So I thank you again for writing it and for sharing with all of us. I'm still really excited that we were able to have this conversation and partner with the National Coalition, our regional chapter of the National Coalition. And, I hope you will watch this space for other nonprofit topics that we will present. This was kind of a unique one for a book talk, but I think a really important topic, a really kind of expands your mind and your thinking, and it's very motivating. So this was great. Anything else, Latifa? I'm looking at the chats here.
No, I was looking as well. I guess you said it, a call to action. Look in the mirror and really think, what is your call to action after experiencing tonight? And then look at it again after you read the book, and then do something.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right, boy, lots of people were inspired by this talk. So good, I guess we did our job. So with that, I think we will we will finish. Any closing remarks, Dr. Freeman, before we sign off?
Well, thank you again. To you, Janine. Again, you reached out to me and we kind of started this conversation and look at what has come of it. And so I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to Latifah Fields and the National Coalition. My friend Monique Curry Mims, thank you so much for stepping up and doing a great job with these awesome questions and being so thoughtful. You know, writing a book is a very kind of solitary act. Spend a lot of time by yourself at the computer or in the archives. And so I always, was eager to be in conversation with communities and readers about it. And so you've given me that opportunity. You're making that dream come true. And so I appreciate all your questions, Monique, and the energy you brought to it. That's what you hope that the book sparks something in people. And you're showing me that it is. And the hearts and the finger snaps and all that means a lot, because you never know. You hope the book resonates. You hope something comes across that'll bless somebody or inspire someone. And so thank you for the gift of your enthusiasm tonight and for your time. So I really appreciate it.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.